In this video, let's talk about scoped slots. Let's go to VS Code. Let me create a Git branch for this view concept, so it will be easier for you to review the code later. Git branch view scoped slots git switch. Okay. npm run dev. Here is the example. Let me create a component, and let's call this component student list.view. Okay. Let's define a prop in this component. Define props, and it's called list. And here, we're going to iterate through this list. v-4 student in list key student.id. I haven't defined student yet, but let's assume that student has an ID. And in here, very simple, let's just print student.name. So this component receives a list as a prop, and use a v-4 to print all students' names. Okay, then let's go to the parent component. First, let's import student list. And here, let's define this list. Here, let's import ref from view. Let me copy and paste an array of students. Okay, as you can see, each student has ID and has a name. Okay, so ID and a name. Very simple one. Okay, then here, let's use student list and pass this list as a prop. So this list is the list here, and this list refers to the prop here. Let's take a look at the browser. Everything works fine. Our lovely client has a new feature request. The client says, now find a student whose name is equal to Harry and make his name color red. And another constraint is that you can only do that logic in this consumer or the parent component. You cannot do it here in student list. I'll explain why there is this strange constraint later. But just now, remember, you can only do it here in the app. Don't touch student list. Let me close this. You're like, okay, that's simple. First, let's define a CSS class to make the name red. Let's call this dot cursed. We know that Harry Potter is the cursed boy. And here is color is red. Let me collapse this. Then what should we do? You're like, okay, that's easy. We can do this. Let's have a span. Within the span, we can print student name dot name. And we can use v-bind to bind this cursed CSS class to this span. Class cursed student name is equal to Harry. Let me break it so you can see it clearly. Does it make sense? So if this Boolean expression evaluates to true, then this cursed CSS class is on, and that will make the student name red. Otherwise, this cursed is off, so the name will be printed in black. Does it work? Refresh. It does not work because the content here, this is the template content, has no access to things in the child component. Okay, now let's take a look at the child component. You see, we can access each student's ID and name in this child component, student list. But can you do that here? in the parent component or the consumer component? No. So we cannot use this here. What should we do? We need to let the student list component, this one, expose each student's information to its parent component or the consumer component using something called scoped slots. So here's how we do that. In the student list component, let me cut this. We need to define a scoped slot. And here is the syntax. Slot. And we put student.name in the slot. And then we're going to bind this student instance to an attribute in slot called stu. Now here we're using v-bind. This attribute can be anything. It can be stu, it can be stu123, or simply just student. And here I pick stu, but this is just a custom attribute I put on the slot tag. Attributes bound to a slot element are called slot props. So here we have one slot prop, which is stu. Once we define this scoped slot with slot props, here there's only one slot prop, then how do we retrieve the slot prop in the consumer component? Here is the syntax. So first, let me cut this. Then we need to create a template. And then paste. On the template tag, do you remember we can use the v-slot directive? We learned that in named slots. v-slot. Since there is only one slot here in the child component, then the slot name is default. And here we're going to type slot props. All right, let me explain. In the student list component, attributes bound to a slot element, in this case stu, are called slot props. You know that. Now go back to the consumer component. This slot props is an object that includes all the slot props. Well, in this case, there's only one, stu. So here's how we retrieve the stu using slot props. Slot props dot stu. Copy and also paste it here. Now, as you can see, when I refresh, Harry's name is now in red color. All right, let's do a summary here. Take a look at this image, which illustrates what we just did. In this example, the consumer component app wants to access student name to see if the name is equal to Harry or not. However, each individual student is only accessible to this student list component. To make this also available in the consumer component, we created a scoped slot in the student list component and bound the current student to a slot prop called stu. You can call it any name you want, stu, stu123, and so on. Now back into the consumer component. This slot props is a JavaScript object that includes all the slot props that we defined in the student list component. In this case, there's only one prop, stu. By the way, this slot props name can really be anything. So here I can call it slot props or simply call it, for example, Bing, okay? But you have to make sure everything here is also changed to Bing. Refresh, you see it still works. But by convention, we want to call this JavaScript object slot props. But the name can really be anything. It is just an object that encapsulates all the slot props that we defined in the child component, in this case, the student list component. Okay, let's move on. Then the content in the template, and we call this the slot content. To be more specific, it is scoped slot content. We'll replace the scoped slot outlet that we defined in the student list. Like this. Remember, a slot will eventually be replaced by the slot content provided by the consumer component. Feel free to pause the video and make sure you understand this picture. All right. Well, if you think this syntax is kind of verbose, right? Vue provides shorthands. So here, instead of using a JavaScript object, we can use JavaScript destructuring feature to just retrieve STU. So I do not have to have this and this. It still works. So I'm only interested in the STU slot prop in that JavaScript object, slot props. We can keep shortening this. Now recall that we can use pound sign for short to replace it. Refresh. It still works. A few minutes ago, I said there is a constraint. We must do the logic in the consumer component. I'm sure many students will have this question. Why bother? If we move this logic of determining if a student's name is equal to Harry or not from the consumer component to the student list component, then we no longer need to use scope slots. Let me show you. So here, let me cut this, remove this, and get rid of this. Okay? And then let's go to student list, get rid of this, paste. And we need to move this one from here to here. And of course, this one is student name. Okay, it works, right? And the good thing is the code is simpler and we don't have to use the scope slots passing things around, right? So why we have to do it in the consumer component? There are two reasons. All right, first, let me change it back to where we were. The first reason is from the responsibility perspective. Who is responsible for making the name red if the name is equal to Harry? The responsibility of this component, student list, is to print student names as is. Making a name red is a custom requirement of the consumer, in this case, the app component. Let's go to the slides. Assume there is an app called Hogwarts app that is using this student list component. And here is one requirement. We need to print student names, but make Harry's name red. You just saw that. Now, let's say there is another app. For example, MIT app. It also needs to print a list of students. So it is reusing the same student list component. But here, we no longer have this requirement of making Harry's name red. Maybe we want to make everyone's name silver gray. That's the color of MIT. And you know that we can easily get it down by using scope slot. So my point here is the custom logic stays in the consumer components. That is the MIT app and also Hogwarts app. We're not polluting the logic in the student list component. And maybe there is a third app that is reusing this student list. And in this case, Stanford app wants to print all its students' names in italic. And again, we can use scope slots to do that. My point here is this student list component may be used by multiple consumer components, but it has only one responsibility, is that to print the names as is. The scoped slots provide an opportunity for the consumers to provide custom logic to influence how names are printed. So the custom logic should stay in the consumer components. That is Hogwarts app, MIT app, and Stanford app. We should not put those custom logic in the student list component. That's why it is not a good idea to put the logic of making a student's name red in student list component. The key is separation of concerns. Let me talk about the second reason for using scoped slots. Let's go back to VS Code. In this example, we developed both the consumer and the student list component by ourselves. We have access over the code of the student list. What if the student list component is not developed by us? For example, it is from a third-party component library. So think of this as a black box. You have no access to the code. Let me close this file. You can only import it and use it, but you cannot modify its code. However, we still want to customize the color of the name, like make Harry's name red. So the scope slot that is defined in the student list component provides an opportunity to the consumers of this component to customize the behavior of the student list component. The default behavior of this component is to print name as is in color black, but if I want to print Harry as red, we can do it here through scoped slots. How convenient is that? So, scope slots are used very often in component libraries. If you are the developer of a Vue component library, I highly recommend you use scope slots to give your future users a chance to customize it. You will get a lot of users by doing that, right? So I think now is a perfect opportunity for me to show you a popular Vue UI component library. It is called Element Plus, and how it uses scoped slots. And that will support my second reason. Okay, so here is the story. We're going to request 200 to-dos from this URL and display them in a very nice table. All right, so let me close student list. We're not going to use it anymore. Let me collapse this. HR. I'm going to put everything in one file so it's easier for you to review the code. But those are not relevant anymore. So first, let's define a reactive JavaScript array. Const to-do list ref. Next, let me define a function to fetch the to-do list from a remote API endpoint. Let's call this function get to-do list. And here I'm going to use const response to receive the returned data. Await fetch. By the way, fetch is built in. You can use fetch directly here. And here is the URL. And you can find this URL in the description of this video. And then we can retrieve the data. Await response dot JSON. Recall that this JSON method converts a JSON object to a JavaScript object. Then let me log it so you can see the data. And finally, we're going to assign it to this empty list. Okay, so it's not happy. We have to use async. So if you're using await in your method body, you have to use async. Then when do we invoke this? Because this is the definition. It's not invoked yet. We can use Vue lifecycle hook unmounted. Get to-do list. Okay, when this live hook is executed, we're going to fetch a bunch of to-dos, which is by default 200 from this API endpoint. All right, so let's test. So refresh, and then let's press F12. Okay, as you can see, now we have an array of 200 to-dos. And each to-do has user ID, ID of the to-do, title, completed or not. So this is a Boolean value. Next, I want to render the 200 to-dos on my page in a table format. Of course, you can define your own table component. But come on, if there is a free open source Vue component library out there, why should you start from scratch? Next, let me introduce Element Plus. Element Plus is a Vue 3 based component library for designers and developers like you and me. The whole point of using a component library is to reuse components designed by other people, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So let's take a look at its documentation. Let's click Component. Element Plus makes many common components like button. And here we have forms. And then we have badge, calendar, card, carousel, collapse, and here is table, timeline, navigation, alert, dialog, drawer, and so on and so forth. They're all made public, so we just need to customize them and then reuse. Element Plus is one of the best view-based UI component libraries. There are other alternatives like Vuetify and so on. So first, let's install Element Plus in our Vue project. So let's go to Guide and click Installation. All right, so first, let's copy this, npm install Element Plus, and go back to VS Code, paste, npm install Element Plus. Okay, then let's go back to the document and click Quick Start. Okay, for demo purpose, let's do a full import. Copy this too, and make sure here we also use app.use Element Plus. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go to main.js, paste, .use Element Plus. All right. Let's go back to the document and let's find component by searching table. And for this demo, let's just use the basic table. So it looks pretty good. There are 3 columns. Then how do I use it? Before I copy the code, I'll look at the example code for this one. So let's click this one, view source. To use this component, all I need to do is to copy this snippet. And let's go back to VS Code. Paste. Okay, now we have the 3 columns, date, name, and address. Apparently, they correspond to the 3 labels here, date, name, and address. Please note, this el-table is not a built-in HTML tag. It is a component from Element Plus. The first time you use Element Plus, things look a little bit scary, since there are so many new tags like el-table, el-table column, and there are also new attributes like data, prop, and so on. Don't worry, let's look at the structure one by one. So this is the table that corresponds to this entire table. And inside, there are 3 child components. el-table column, el-table column, and el-table column. Those are 3 components. First, let's change the column names. Okay, so here let's press F12. And here is the data we want to show. User ID, ID, title, and completed. So we need 4 columns. So the first one is user ID. Then here is the ID of the to-do. This is title. And let's call the last one status. It is either completed or not completed. Okay, so refresh. Now we have the 4 columns. All right, next, how do we get the data in to-do list from here to here? And what is this data? What is table data? Every time you have a question, go to the official document. All right, for basic table. So it says I'm supposed to set attribute data of this el-table with an object array. After this, we can use prop corresponding to a key of the object in data array in el-table column to insert data to table columns. And of course, this label is the name of the column. We have done that. You can also use attribute width to define the width of columns. Now in this example, here they have a JavaScript array called table data with 4 objects. And then we're using vbind to bind this array to this attribute data. Then in here, the first prop is date, second one is name, third one is address. Okay, got it. So let's go back to VS Code. Let's change this to to-do list. And here, let me remind ourselves, user ID. So make sure you don't have a typo. User ID, ID, title, and here is completed. Okay, let me refresh again. All right, no warning. Okay, so it looks very well. So here we're binding this to-do list from the script to this component using prop. So now there are 200 to-dos. Wow. I might want to just throw away this to-do list. So for this status, I don't like the user experience. So false, true, you and me, we're computer scientists. We may understand what this is. But I really want to display this in a very user-friendly way, maybe using a badge or a tag. Let's go to the documentation. And let's use a tag. Here we go, tag. All right, that looks nice. So I want to use a green tag for completed. I want to use a red tag for not completed. So let's look at the source code. So here we're going to use the success for completed and then danger for incomplete to-dos. So let's go back to VS Code. How do I do this? Well, apparently I should put the two tags here. Then how do I decide which tag to use, the green one or the red one, based on the Boolean value in completed? Here in the consumer component, we have no access to each to-do. We only pass to-do list to the EL-table. This is very similar to the student list example. We need to use scoped slots. Luckily, Element Plus has predefined scope slots for EL-table column, so we can use it very conveniently. So here is the syntax. Let me copy and paste. And let's call this completed. And this is incomplete. This one is danger. All right, the problem here is that we have both rendered here, but we really want to use v-if and v-else to control which one should be rendered. So for example, here I'm going to put true, then every to-do is completed. However, I shouldn't really hard code this. Then what we need to do is, let me cut this and put template here. In the template, we're going to retrieve that slot prop. Do you remember the syntax? v-slot default slot props. Okay, and here slot props. So here we have to access a slot prop. The slot prop name is row dot completed. All right, now everything works, right? Then how do I know this one is called row? Let's go to the documentation. And this one should be here, custom column template. Click here, right here. Customize table column so it can be integrated with other components. You have access to the following data: row, column, or this, and store. Okay, so here is one example. Well, in the documentation, they use a shorthand, so we can do that as well. Let's come here. Okay, and the name they use is scope, but here we're using slot props. It doesn't really matter. Here is how to access the date property of an element in the table data, .row.date. Well, in our case, it is .row.completed. So we're accessing this one, completed, true or false. Just remember, in Element Plus, the slot prop for each item in the array is called row. Okay, now finally, we can also put some style here, maybe stripe. Okay, now we have stripes. I can also add a border. As you can see, there is a border here around this table. All right, looks very good. In summary, there are 3 reasons for introducing Element Plus. First, I want to use this to-do table example to reiterate the importance and application of scoped slots. It is used a lot with third-party component libraries. Second, if you are developing an open source component library, make sure you include scoped slots for each component so that the users or consumers of your library can have a chance to customize your components. Third, I want you guys to get familiar with a component library, so this will improve your productivity with Vue.js. Recall that Vue has an amazing ecosystem. There are many third-party open source projects to support your Vue application development. Look at this example. All we need to do is to prepare the data down here. You still have to do this part. And pass it or bind it to this EL-table. Then boom, the table is there. If you're working on a non-trivial project, using a component library is highly recommended. I included a link to an article about some popular Vue UI component libraries you should know in the description of this video. Check it out. Next, let me push this branch to GitHub. Vue scoped slots. Push. In the next video, let's do a quick summary of Vue slots. See you there.